Hello, welcome to Esoterica and Nonsense, a podcast where we discuss myths, legends, folk tales, fairy tales, supernatural phenomenon, and religions from around the world. I am your host, Annabelle, your shape-shifting fungus from outer space, and I am here on a beautiful day, and this is my third time attempting to record this episode. I have been babysitting dogs, and they have been very disruptive. And I have a dog napping in the other room, and I kept the TV on, hoping that it would pacify them, and we're going to see how this goes. I am an enthusiast of all things magic, all things esoteric, and I find, personally, that either these subjects are taken so seriously to the point of fault, right? To the point where people are approaching magic and esoterica cerebrally. Or, I guess there's like shows and content that's like it's so ridiculous that it ends up being misdirection. I'm just some dude from California, okay? I have partaken in a lot of mind-expanding substances. I've never stopped believing in magic since I was a kid, and I'm genuinely fascinated with ancient culture and how we have misinterpreted it over time. So let's jump right on in to episode 1, Labyrinths. Labyrinths are near and dear to me. 1, because they're so mysterious, and 2, because they often are symbols of entryways into other realms. What I find so interesting, actually, in my research is information about labyrinths extends far past the classic Greek myth that I think is the most famous, at least in the Western world. But essentially, the word labyrinth comes from the pre-Greek origin, and the derivation is not totally certain, but it suggested that the word labyrinthos may be derivative of the word labris, which is a Lydian word for double-bladed axe, which is so fascinating. I've never heard that. So later, labyrinthe, or the Latin form labyrinthus, also meant labyrinth, maze, great building, which may have many corridors and turns, or figuratively used as a bewildering argument, which is very interesting. I've never heard a labyrinth used as a bewildering argument, and I actually would love to incorporate that into my vocabulary. Also, the form labyrinthus in Latin is very similar to the Greek labyrinthos, and that means maze, large building with intricate passages, especially the structure built by Dielidas to hold the Minotaur near Knossos in Crete. So before I move on, I was actually looking into the word maze because I have noticed that maze and labyrinth are sometimes used interchangeably. So the definition of maze is delusion, bewilderment, confusion of thought, possibly from Old English maze, which is suggested to be the compound of amasod, meaning amazed or to confound. So it's kind of like a maze, if you will. But as I was doing more research into the difference between maze and labyrinth, it is a little bit ambiguous because I think technically they're both semi-interchangeable. The biggest difference I found, though, is that a large majority of the time when somebody's referring to a maze, they are referring to a multi-cursal pattern, meaning that there would be dead ends, there would be roads that you're going down that would be misleading, whereas a unicursal form, which is what we associate with the classical labyrinth, has one pathway that leads to the center. Now, that's actually not always definitive. These can change, but as I'll talk about with all of these different labyrinths that I've researched, that sometimes mazes are used more decoratively and labyrinths often have a spiritual meaning attached to them. So I found a really interesting piece of information that sadly I don't have a lot of, but in a Mycenaean inscription, there was an inscription that was interpreted meaning mistress of the labyrinth. And apparently a man named Arthur Evans, who excavated the palace of Knossos in Crete early in the 20th century, suggested that the palace was the original labyrinth, since the double axe motif appears in the palace ruins. And he asserted that the labyrinth could be understood to mean the house of the double axe. The same symbol was discovered in other palaces in Crete. Nielsen observed that in Crete, the double axe is not a weapon and always accompanies goddesses or women and not male gods. Okay, 1 second. Full transparency. A lot of this I am copying, pasting off my direct sources. So basically, this was the only place I could find this. This was through Wikipedia. I was trying to find more sources that talked about the Mistress of the Labyrinth. I'm sure people listening that you have incredible skills researching. I urge you to do your own research and send it in. esotericaandnonsense@gmail.com, please. But what I found so interesting and intriguing was this reference to the house of the double-headed axe and this goddess holding a double-headed axe. I've never heard anything about her, and it's not really mentioned anywhere since, but essentially this archaeologist, Arthur Evans, who excavated this palace of Knossos, assumes that this is where the labyrinth, this ancient, infamous labyrinth, was built. So, in a quick synopsis of the Greek tale, the Cretan labyrinth, on the island of Crete, there was a king Minos, whose wife was hypnotized by the gods, and she ended up having sex with a bull and bearing a son. The son was known as the Minotaur, who was half human and half bull. And apparently King Minos was pissed, which I don't know. I guess most husbands would be pissed if their wife had a man-bull child. But he hired Deileus as an architect to build an elaborate labyrinth to hold the Minotaur. And eventually this Minotaur was killed by Theseus, who was one of the only heroes strong enough to not only kill the Minotaur, but to navigate through the labyrinth. Allegedly, Deileus, the architect of the labyrinth, had so cunningly made the labyrinth that he could barely escape after he had built it. So I just want to touch on, before I keep talking about this labyrinth, from a lot of depictions, like basically the Cretan labyrinth was incredibly famous in Greece and in cultures that spoke of the Cretan labyrinth. It was like a tall tale after a while. But for a while, there was actual labyrinths depicted on Greek currency. And those labyrinths are known as classical unicursal labyrinths, meaning there's one pathway, you go in one entrance, and it goes to the center. And the classical labyrinth essentially kind of has a spirally pattern in the inside. But the Greek labyrinth is square. And so the inside actually looks kind of like the Greek keys, which is that classic ancient Greek pattern that is often used as trim or as like classic decoration. If you don't know what I'm talking about, Google it, the Greek keys. But apparently this original labyrinth that Deileus built was actually multicursal, meaning it was more like a maze. It had different pathways that were designed to be misleading and for someone to get trapped. So apparently this guy, Arthur Evans, this archaeologist, excavated the site at Knossos. And the complexity of the architecture prompted him to suggest that the palace had in fact been the labyrinth of Deileus. He found various bull motifs, including the image of a man leaping over the horns of a bull, as well as depictions of a labrys carved into the walls, the labrys being the double-headed axe. On the strength of a passage of the Iliad, it has been suggested that the palace was the site of a dancing ground made for Adrian by the craftsman Dielidas, where men and women would be sent there as prey for the Minotaur, and beforehand they would have a dancing ceremony. By extension in popular legend, the palace is associated with the myth of the Minotaur. So I've actually seen different documentaries about this, and there's a lot of different theories about the kind of, I guess, sacrifices that were going on. I've heard theories that virgin men and women were being sent to Crete and having like banquets with dancing and then being sent into the labyrinths. A lot of these tall tales allude to the labyrinth being above ground, but a lot of these archaeologists have thought that perhaps the labyrinth was actually a cave, according to the Oxford University geographer, or I guess a geographer associated with Oxford University. His name is Nicholas Haworth. Believes that Evans' hypothesis that the Palace of Knossos is also the labyrinth must be treated skeptically. Haworth and his teams conducted a search for an underground complex known as the Scotino Cave, but concluded that was formed naturally. The site corresponds to a labyrinth symbol on a 16th century map of Crete in a book of maps in the Library of Christ Church, Oxford. The map of the caves themselves was produced by the French in 1821, and the site was also used by the German soldiers to store ammunition during the Second World War. So, according to this geographer from Oxford, he is skeptical that these caves by the Knossos Palace is actually this alleged labyrinth. In this, I saw a documentary, I don't even remember the name. Hence nonsense. I'm a chaotic reporter, so what do you want from me? But in this like ridiculous documentary that I saw, they were saying that in the entryway of this cave, which had an incredible amount of caves and caverns that were impossible to navigate without having like gear and rappelling gear and climbing gear and everything. But they were saying that they had found artifacts in the entryway of the cave, artifacts that pointed signs to banquets. There was bones and chalices made out of pottery, and it had been clear that perhaps people were like partying in this cave, and that maybe the cave is where the bull had actually been. I did find it interesting, though, this little Easter egg that the Germans were storing ammunition there during the Second World War. I mean, that's a whole other tangent that is for another day, but the Third Reich was on a quest for the Holy Grail. I guess specifically Hitler was on a quest for the Holy Grail, and apparently was part of his conquest of Europe was actually searching for ancient artifacts and secrets of antiquity that had been buried over time. What I find interesting, though, about all of this is that, of course, in the legend, Dielidas is the architect of this labyrinth, whereas people are now assuming that this naturally formed cave is the labyrinth. But in some of my later research, as I'll point out, a lot of ancient labyrinths were apparently actually built underground and have been lost over time because of people forgetting where they are. And, you know, if something's underground, how are you going to find it? So perhaps there is another labyrinth on the property. Who am I to say? However, what I found most interesting, actually, in my research is that this Greek labyrinth is by no means the oldest labyrinth. Allegedly, there are actually quite a few labyrinths that are older. Pliny, the Roman philosopher and historian, wrote in his book of natural history, he wrote of 4 examples of ancient labyrinths, one being the Cretan labyrinth, also an Egyptian labyrinth, a Lemnian labyrinth, and an Italian labyrinth. And these were all complex underground structures, and it appears to have been the standard classical understanding of the word. Which really has me thinking, because before I had done this research, I had never really known that the classical understanding of the labyrinth was in fact underground. And it also makes me think of Pan's Labyrinth. And in that film, the labyrinth is actually a portal into the underworld, which, I mean, applause. Well done. Well fucking done. So, my notes are incredibly chaotic, but I work best in chaos. So, the next labyrinth, before I move on to the labyrinths that Pliny spoke about, I found some information about Babylonian labyrinths. Sadly, there's not a lot of information about what these were used for. A lot of ancient Babylonian culture has been erased over centuries of colonization and religious rule. I mean, I think that goes for every part of the world. I think a lot of times when a place is colonized, a religion will mandate change of language and change of faith and often destroy relics. But apparently, there is some engravings on stone from the Middle Babylonian to Neo-Babylonian times, from about 1500 to 500 BCE. Now they're held in a museum in Berlin, and some are in the Louvre, and some are in the Leiden. It says the Rijksmuseum, which sounds like Reykjavik, so maybe maybe it's in Iceland. I actually am not sure. And there's also some in Syria where these labyrinths are now held. But they're essentially a grid of small labyrinths carved into stone. And apparently, some historians believe that they are showing the intestines of sacrificial animals as a pattern for diviners, describing how to interpret them for oracle purposes. Apparently, well, okay, these labyrinths that I'm talking about, these Babylonian labyrinths, have two entrances. They're all very similar in the sense that they resemble a spiral. Not all of them. They all kind of have a slightly different roadmap, and they're depicted in a grid. They all have two entrances. Some are actually way more creative than others. Like some almost cross over themselves and like spiral over themselves. Others are like pretty straightforward. Some theories I've heard with labyrinths that have two entrances is that they were used for marriages, so that like each spouse would enter in the separate entrances and meet in the middle, or that double entrance labyrinths could be used for sacrifices, kind of like a hunter and prey. I don't know if I buy that these were used as roadmaps for diviners. I mean, from what I know about ancient practices, having for the art of divination, I don't know if I buy that they were making like inscription, like almost manuals for divination. Also, looking at these labyrinths, I highly recommend you look them up, but they don't really look like animal intestines. They look way too neat. I mean, I think an animal intestine wouldn't be splayed in perfect spirals. Like, you'd have to arrange them this way, right? So how would that be a way to divine if you're arranging them? These look, they look to me more like a blueprint, maybe like maps of different labyrinths that are built in other places. Maybe, I don't know. I really wish I had a better idea. A lot of the tablets that have been found are not in perfect form, so they have edges that have been chipped off. But there's at least 7, 8, 9 labyrinths that are in like perfect condition, and they definitely look hand done. There's not like the practiced mathematical precision. They're all kind of small, and they all are organic looking, and these would predate the Cretan tale of the labyrinth if it was in fact true. Now, the next labyrinth that I want to discuss is the Egyptian labyrinth, which I had never heard about. More generally, labyrinth might be applied to an extremely complicated maze-like structure. Oh my gosh. We need to work on our English, and by we, I mean me. So apparently, according to Pliny and according to Herodotus, these ancient philosophers and world travelers, apparently there had been a labyrinth, which was a building complex in Egypt near the place called the City of Crocodiles, or Crocodilopolis. And it was considered, its beauty was considered to surpass the pyramids. So this building complex was said to have 12 covered courts, 6 in a row facing north, 6 facing south. The gates of the one range exactly fronting the gates of the other. Inside the building, there was 2 stories that contained 3,000 rooms. 1,500 of the rooms were above ground, and 1,500 of them were underground, and they mirrored each other. So apparently, the above and below ground floor plans were identical. So according to Herodotus, he was never allowed to actually see the below ground ones because they were used as tombs for the great kings who built them, and the tombs of the sacred crocodiles. But the upper rooms he was allowed to tour, and in his words, he says, the upper rooms, on the contrary, I actually did see, and it is hard to believe that they are the work of men. The baffling and intricate passages from room to room and from court to court were an endless wonder to me, as we passed from a courtyard into rooms, from rooms into galleries, from galleries into more rooms, and thence into yet more courtyards. The roof of every chamber, courtyard, and gallery is like the walls of stone. The walls are covered with carved figure, and each court is exquisitely built of white marble surrounded by a colonnade. Which sounds fucking incredible. So this is a 3,000 room situation. So apparently, quite a bit later, there was a German monk, a priest, who actually traveled to Egypt and in 1670 and drew a floor plan of this labyrinth. It's incredible. So I'm looking at it now. There's like a central courtyard that has a labyrinth in it that has 4 quadrants. And then around the labyrinth, because it's square, each room around the labyrinth is a square. And apparently, let's see, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Apparently, from what I understand, there was 12 to symbolize like each province of Egypt. And each, I guess it's not a quadrant, whatever you would call a 12th of a square, has its own little floor plan. So like dotted around the courtyard, there's all these other smaller labyrinths. Some are like more symmetrical in shape. Some are like pretty circular. Some are pretty like uneven. Like there's like oval, like almost like oval collages. Like each little area has gardens and fountains speckled into them that are, it's basically like labyrinths inside of labyrinths. And inside of each little mini labyrinth, there is some kind of statue or garden or fountain, which is epic. And then surrounding this whole complex, there are a series of pillars and deities allegedly carved out of marble. It's unbelievable. And I'm also not surprised that there's allegedly an Egyptian labyrinth. I mean, obviously, we all know that Rome borrowed a lot of culture and ended up kind of recycling a lot of Greek ideas into their culture, religion, government, everything. But I think as Westerners, it's easy to forget how much Egypt influenced that whole part of the world. I mean, they were obviously sharing culture and sharing so many stories and things, but Egypt was established in a very spiritual civilization and with incredible skill for construction. And I'm baffled that I actually hadn't heard of this. So apparently during the 19th century, the remains of this ancient Egyptian structure was actually discovered. So for a while, people thought that this was myth. They thought that this was made up because no one had heard of it. And, during the first part of this millennia, or I guess last millennia, there was a lot of colonization by Romans, by different Arab empires. And sadly, because of that, a lot of relics had been destroyed on the mere fact that it wasn't a part of the new religion, whatever that religion was. So in the 19th century, the remains were actually discovered in Hawara, in the Fayum Oasis. I hope I don't think I'm pronouncing this right, and I strongly apologize. I struggle enough with English, so I really do try my best. But apparently, it was a Belgian man named Flinders Petrie who discovered this at the foot of a pyramid that was built by a 12th dynasty pharaoh known as Amenemhat III, who reigned from 1860 BCE to 1814 BCE. So we are talking about almost 4,000 years ago that this structure was most likely built. Which, I mean, okay. Hearing these things really gets my goat. Because one, that's so fucking cool that 4,000 years ago, a pharaoh was commissioning architects to design labyrinths inside of labyrinths and to build 3,000 rooms, 15 above ground, 15 below ground, which is a beautiful, intensely beautiful, like metaphor and mirroring of the above world and underworld. But anyway, what I'm saying is, here we are in 2022, and we still don't know how they built the pyramids, and we're building houses that within 10 years are growing black mold, and if we weren't keeping them up, in a couple hundred years would fall to the ground. And 4,000 years ago, they're carving things into marble. I mean, it's incredibly extravagant. And obviously, I've heard that slave labor was used. So I'm just saying I'm impressed with the ability, the means in which they did it. I'm not sure. And I don't think anyone's sure. That's kind of what I'm saying. I think ancient culture has so much to teach us that we could never even dream of understanding how they accomplish all this. I'm incredibly impressed, and I'm slightly envious of the spectacular beauty that one could behold. Anyway, back to Flinders Petrie, who is this Egyptologist who was Belgian. He uncovered the foundation in the 1800s, and he discovered the remains of a huge foundation more than 300 meters broad and 400 meters beneath the sand, 4 meters beneath the sand. He concluded that this was the remains of the foundations for the labyrinth, with the structure itself being long since quarried and destroyed, leading experts to theories that the labyrinth was demolished under the reign of Ptolemy II and used to build the nearby city of Shedit to honor his wife Arsinoe, which is so typical. Oh my gosh. I mean, that's very Mexico City, right? I mean, the center square in Mexico City had once been pyramids that the locals, the Mexica people, had built themselves, and the Spanish demolished it and used the same stones to build the church and a lot of the other buildings in the center square. So I think it was not very long ago where they had dug down in the center square to do construction and quote unquote discovered the bases of these pyramids, but they weren't really discovered, were they? They had been erased and forgotten and rediscovered, and that's kind of what I'm hearing here in the story of this labyrinth. It was rediscovered after it being destroyed, and the stones and the pieces that had been used to build this were repurposed to build a different city. So in a way, like, it's all lost. It's contaminated evidence. The crime scene's been contaminated and transferred out of the area. But without a doubt, the expedition led by Petri had stumbled upon one of the most incredible discoveries in the history of Egypt. And they did not even need to excavate in order to confirm the finding. However, the finding was quickly suppressed since the Secretary General of the Supreme Council of Antiquities in Egypt put a hold to all further communications about the discovery due to Egyptian national security sanctions. Okay, hold on. In their defense, this was in the 1800s. In their defense, beforehand, Egypt had gone through centuries of reign from different Muslim empires, and they had destroyed a lot of Egyptian relics. They had also outlawed the practice of speaking the ancient Egyptian language and had imposed a tax to people who were non-Muslim. And apparently different rulers of Egypt had no interest in ancient Egyptian relics and were freely giving away all kinds of incredible relics to kind of gain the favor of, European rulers. So that's why we hear all these stories of British and French and Belgian and all these European countries coming to Egypt and just having a free-for-all in the desert and looting tombs. Sadly, a lot of it wasn't actually being looted. They were totally given the green light as a way to kind of sweeten the pot so that they could do political deals with those countries, which is such a fucking bummer. I mean, we're talking about the gold mine of a lot of human civilization and culture and practices that are still being practiced even today in Western culture that we don't even realize are from Egypt because it's all been fucking looted. Anyway, apparently, up until 12 years ago, the discovery was still being suppressed. So archaeologists today believe that there's an incredible potential that this site is being slowly and irrevocably destroyed by both inaction by authorities and the water table of the area that's rising. And the issue, apparently, the biggest issue is that, compared to, let's say, the pyramids of Giza or, the Sphinx, there isn't an immediate, there's not immediate wonder to take in. At this point, it's all subterranean. All of the above ground structures have already been destroyed and taken away. So at this point, it's excavation. And without that wow factor, there's less likely to get a green light. Also the conspiracy theorist in me thinks that anytime they don't want to undig something, my mind always goes to why? What's the agenda? Maybe there's a reason. But also it is a totally valid reason that a lot of Egypt has been looted, and a lot of archaeological teams have been from completely other parts of the world that aren't Egypt. And so I understand that Egypt would have a lot to lose. But selfishly, I want to know what's down there, and I want them to check it out because it sounds fucking cool. So apparently, as I said earlier, the pharaoh that was thought to have built this was named Amenemhat III. He was a pharaoh of ancient Egypt he was the sixth king of the 12th dynasty of the Middle Kingdom. He was elevated to the throne as co-regent by his father, Senusret III, with whom he shared the throne as active king for 20 years. During his reign, Egypt attained its cultural and economic zenith of the Middle Kingdom, which reigned at least 45 years in the 19th and 18th centuries BC. So think about that. The ruins were discovered in the 19th century CE. So this century, or I guess last century, you know what I mean. But 2 centuries ago. Whatever. I'm saying this millennia. I'm just blown away. What's 18 times 2? 36? Right? So that's 3,600 years apart that allegedly these buildings were resurrected versus when they were rediscovered. That's fucking crazy. So allegedly it's possible that these labyrinths are older than even the Babylonian labyrinths. Amenemhat III inherited a stable and peaceful Egypt and directed his efforts toward an extensive building program with particular focus on Fayum. He dedicated a temple to Sobek, the goddess, and a chapel. And basically, apparently, this pyramid and this above and below ground labyrinth was the ultimate mausoleum, museum, if you will. And I would love to know what the below ground building would have been like. But for now, we don't know. Okay, so the next labyrinth I want to talk about, there's so many more labyrinths. This is literally a gold mine of labyrinths. So the next labyrinth I am going to talk about is known as the Padma Vyuha or the Chakra Vyuha, which is a labyrinth from ancient India, depicted in the Hindu epic known as the Mahabharata. Again, I'm trying my best to pronunciate. So this labyrinth has a very near and dear place in my heart and actually sparked why I wanted to research more about labyrinths, because I've always loved labyrinths. I mean, I have always just kind of been obsessed with them. But earlier this year, I started getting really into meditation. And in fact, I started seeing a labyrinth inside of my mind's eye. And it took me a long time to study it because it's not really like a movie or like looking at a photograph when you're meditating. It's much more abstract. And so I had to use very interesting ways to figure out the shape of this labyrinth. But the labyrinth I was seeing in my meditations was in fact the Chakra Vyuha, which blew my fucking mind. And so in the research I did on it, I was really surprised that apparently this was actually a war formation. Apparently it resembles defensive walls, which I'll get to later, but there's some stories in Nepal, for example, and other parts of the world where they believed that the labyrinth was actually used to keep a palace safe or even keep a city safe, and that the walls into the city were a labyrinth. So this particular labyrinth, though, was used differently, was actually used as a human formation to capture a important person of the enemy without having to injure them. So the shape of this labyrinth is actually similar to the unicursal classical labyrinth. The classic unicursal labyrinth kind of has an upside down U as the center, and then it kind of ends up turning into a spiral on the outside. This one has a perfect spiral on the inside and eventually branches out to be I'm pretty sure a 7-circuit labyrinth. What I find so interesting, though, about this shape is that it actually mirrors the labyrinth on the Greek coins. The only difference is on the Greek coins, it is a square shape, whereas this is a perfectly circular shape. But I thought that was a really interesting overlap. So apparently the formation begins with 2 soldiers standing back to back, with the other set of soldiers standing at a distance of 3 hands, drawing up 7 circles and culminating in the end, which is the place where the captured person or object would be kept. So basically, what they're alluding to is that these human soldiers would create this shape of this labyrinth, and the number of soldiers would be calculated as per the resistance estimated. I guess the idea is that from the outside, it would just look kind of chaotic. It wouldn't look like, men standing in a straight line. You wouldn't be able to identify a formation because of its spiraling pattern. So from dead up, if you're looking at it from from dead on, you would kind of see two soldiers in front of you. And I think the idea is you'd be lured in and you'd keep fighting these soldiers, but eventually you would kind of be put into the center of these 7 circles of men. And eventually they would all turn in to face you and you would be trapped. And the idea would be that they would be able to move you off of the battlefield quickly without very much trouble. So if you were, let's say, like a general or a king or, someone of high importance, someone that would be worth capturing. So what I found so interesting about this story is obviously, if you can't tell, I've never been in the army, and I also am I don't like fighting. I don't like play fighting. But from what I know about combat, creating a labyrinth shape and then having a person walk through it, like, my question is, like, why not just have concentric circles and then have someone like walk into the center and then just kind of close them in? I think what they're alluding to is that this man would end up walking the whole labyrinth, which would take forever, right? I mean, as the crow flies, the center is right there. But if you follow the whole labyrinth, it would take quite a while to actually get all the way through. So basically, I'm confused by the efficiency of this formation. In a war situation, is this actually practical? Which kind of brings me back to metaphor. I think a lot of scriptures, again, this is me speculating. I repeat, I am not a professional. And that's part of why I want to do this, because, I mean, I don't want to get too political, but I think if you're going to school in a Western country studying Eastern religion, like, do you actually have the best education? Because trying to understand other cultures and learning it from people who aren't from that culture, it becomes problematic. But here I am, just someone going on Wikipedia and Google and just trying my best. So again, this is all pontification. I would also love to hear your opinion. But my mind goes towards some kind of metaphor. So in this battle, right, we're talking about war, we're talking about an enemy of interest. So what is this all signifying? So, like, from what I understand of self, from dreams, from religion, is that we are all one. We are all actually one thing. We are tiny organisms inside one big animal, right? For example, this planet would actually be one thing, and we're all just tiny things like cells that are a part of it, but not separate. So in this idea of a war, what would a war be? It would be an opposition against ourselves. So this enemy would actually be something, the general, something that's high up. We don't actually want to kill it, right? We want to actually take it out of the war scenario to negotiate, or to at least, like, de-escalate. So where my mind goes is that the labyrinth is actually a mantra. It's actually a meditation tool, that by having your enemy walk through this long labyrinth, that by the time they get to the center, they are removable from the battlefield, as in, like, they have lost their anger, they have lost the need to fight. And it actually brings me back to the Greek concept, because the Minotaur is also held in a labyrinth and he can never get out, which I find so interesting, because technically the Minotaur can get out. It's not like they closed the labyrinth. That's what's so weird. Why have a labyrinth that doesn't have a gate or like an actual enclosure, right? I mean, there's so many other things you could build for such a monster that would keep it in, but why use the idea of the labyrinth? And it seems to me that it's really more of a symbol of, by the time you make it to the center, or if you start in the center and then try to leave, you're no longer a threat, because there is such a meditative practice. I highly recommend Googling a labyrinth or trying to draw a labyrinth yourself, which is also a brain teaser, but to just trace it with your finger, it's so meditative. Or, if you've ever walked through a labyrinth, it's oddly stimulating and very calming at the same time. And so anyway, that's where my mind kind of drifts to. There's also this really interesting carving which is in the Hoysalwara, Hoysalswara temple in Halbidu, India. And there's a carving in this temple depicting this labyrinth, and it's really incredible. It has the labyrinth, but like the whole labyrinth is stuffed with people and animals. It kind of reminds me of Tibetan mandalas that have, from far away it's a mandala, but up close there's people and things in each. It's all filled, and so it almost kind of looks like the circle of life. And mystifying that I was actually meditating about that this year. Single baked bean, what could it mean? I don't know. So in Nepal, actually, I also found out that there was stories of a labyrinth in Nepal. Apparently, the Vatican, which I actually didn't really know to the extent that the Vatican was doing this, but the Vatican started doing missionary work in different parts of the world to just try to learn more about other cultures, and specifically, I think that there was one agenda of trying to convert people, but I think the other agenda was actually trying to map out the rest of the world and also gain insight on their history. So in 1703, they embarked on a specific mission to Nepal and Tibet over a period of about 70 years. And they sent a large number of missionaries to these remote Himalayan countries, let's make a movie out of that. The missionary father Cassiano de Makarata was traveling in 1740 through Nepal on his way from India to Tibet. In his account of the journey, he writes that he saw some ruins in the jungle, which he later was told was the remains of the ancient city of Skimangada, whose walls was said to have formed a labyrinth around the city. So, in some of my other research that I read, apparently some cultures, the word labyrinth referred to a palace, and then eventually it ended up referring to the city. But again, these were all alleged tales that this missionary was hearing, Cassiano was hearing. So apparently the walls formed a labyrinth around the city, and Cassiano adds that the plan of the city can be found wrought in stone in the palace of Batgao, which is modern Bhaktapur, located in Nepal, which gives me tingles because I've actually been to Bhaktapur, and I didn't go all the way in because they were charging, and at the time I didn't have a bunch of money, so I ended up just roaming like the outskirts of the city. And to get into the center of the city, you have to like pay a tourist fee, which I totally support them on. I just didn't have I just wasn't a high roller. But it is kind of crazy to me that apparently in the royal palace there is this blueprint for this ancient city with the labyrinth going around it. So this ancient city was known as Skimangada, and apparently the ancient Nepalese people, I guess this wasn't that long ago, this was in 1703, but the people in Nepal at the time claimed that their kings originated from this ancient city, and it was not possible to enter it without wheeling around and around again for about a month. So it would take a month to walk the labyrinth. And the city was situated in the center of this quasi-labyrinth enclosed by high walls. And the labyrinth, which was impossible to enter except in one single spot, after having entered it, one had to pass between four fortresses, which were evenly distributed from place to place between the barriers of the labyrinth, and these barriers had a distance from one side to the other of 1 kos, which is 2 miles, which love that. I love new increments. So basically, I'm looking at a kind of diagram of this ancient city's labyrinths, and this has the classic 7-circuit classical shape. So instead of having a spiral center, it's an upside down U center, and then eventually it kind of ends up looking like a spiral on the outside. But essentially where all the dead ends are, so there's like 2 on the outer part and 2 on the inner part, that's where the fortresses are. So I guess the idea is if you were to walk this labyrinth, entering wouldn't be enough. These fortresses would be there to stop you if you didn't have clearance. Apparently, within the enclosures, there was fields and small streams which watered them. Food supplies produced by the fields within the enclosures were sufficient to feed the large population, which was governed by a great king, who also had a vast domain around the outside enclosures, which were governed by one of his prime ministers. Apparently, one of these men, his prime ministers, who had received disapproval of the king, swore to take vengeance by betraying his fatherland and surrendering it to the Muslims. Therefore, the intensity. The plan was agreed with by the emperor, and with numerous troops, the prime minister took up the entrance of the labyrinth and forcing the defensive wall opposite of the other side and entered the city. So essentially they had kind of hopped the pivotal fence. They didn't walk the labyrinth, and they hopped over so that they could just go straight to the palace, which, I mean, if you ask me, that's where the fortresses should be. They hopped at the most critical, easiest point to hop, which was like a really bad call. Also, looking at the diagram, if you came in the backside, I guess it would be hard to hop all the walls. Essentially, if this was like a real thing, I think they could have done a better job in the way that they organized the fortresses. I don't think it was incredibly efficient. You know, who's to say? So apparently, once this prime minister had led all these people in through, they had hopped the fence. A lot of the people living there had succeeded in saving their lives and saving themselves by escaping through the breach in the walls. So actually one of the sons of the king actually escaped to Nepal, where he eventually managed to settle and subdue the native king, and he seized his kingdom. But apparently a large majority of the inhabitants were massacred, which is such a bummer. So much has repeatedly been told about the city of Skimangada in Nepal, and a lot of this has kind of like become a tall tale. It's become alleged. So this part is like a little bit confusing. In the research I was doing about this, there was also there was like moats that were allegedly also placed somewhere around this, and a Tibetan monk known as Dharmavasim, who came to Nepal in the first half of the 13th century, described that the Simrongar, and he states that the city was surrounded by 7 walls, which had a height equal to that of a Tibetan fort. And he also writes that the Raga, who was the king's, his palace was located outside the city walls with 11 large gates, which is surrounded by 21 ditches with water and rows of trees. So apparently the reliability of this monk was considered to be doubtful. He said the reason why is because he said there were 600,000 houses in the city, which they believe is clearly exaggerated. But what I'm interested in is that it's almost like he's mentioning that the palace actually had its own, even more elaborate private labyrinth, whereas the city had also had a bunch of gates, but specifically the palace had even more. And what if there was 600,000 houses outside of his palace? Who's to say? That would be crazy. I have been to Bhaktapur, and it was a really big, it was like house to house. There was like apartments and buildings all, it really did kind of look like a medieval metropolis. It didn't look quite European, but when we think of medieval Europe and having large buildings that all kind of merged together, like, so from above it looks like just a bunch of single roof homes, but then from the street they actually kind of look like series of apartment buildings that share roofs, and kind of like a never-ending city vibe. That's what it looked like. It was honestly so beautiful. Nepal is one of the most beautiful places I've ever been to. Anyway, moving on. Next up, we have one of the most fascinating labyrinths that I found, which is native to the Americas. First of all, I want to preface that a lot of the research I did on labyrinths and things that resemble labyrinths from the Americas, that I'm skeptical of some of the sources because it's very clear that they were written by academic white people. I am a white person. And also, so many natives were murdered in horrible genocides and diseases and murdering their food sources and poisoning their waters. And so I think that it's important to remember that a lot of their culture has been erased, but also the culture that lives on, I'm not sure how much they're sharing openly anymore anyway, because they've been incredibly disrespected. And in my opinion, I think that Western society is incredibly dismissive of anything that can't be explained by science, and more specifically explained by like the most closed-minded white male scientist. I realize that my beliefs are polarizing. I'm open-minded. I'm not saying that like all white scientists are closed-minded. I'm just saying that like the culture that we are in, specifically the United States, I'm talking about the United States, was built on puritanical values and white supremacy. And my point being that I wish that I had access to more information about the labyrinths from the Americas, because sadly there was not as much as I wish there was. The most famous labyrinths that I discovered from the Americas is from the O'odham people of Arizona. This labyrinth is pretty remarkable. One of the most, I guess, what's the word? Like distinguishable. In my opinion, it's so different from all the other labyrinths I've seen. It has a circular shape, and the actual walls or pathways of the labyrinth aren't actually the same thickness. So there's like a round side where all the lines create perfect spheres, but towards the center they have more, it looks like a sun that's emanating rays. And then there's also even a human form standing in it. So it's often known as the man in the maze. So in the native language, it is known as the Iatoi or Iati, which I'm sure I'm saying incorrectly. I've actually looked up how to pronounce these words specifically, and I didn't find any definitive resources, so I truly apologize. So according to the cosmology of the O'odham people, who again reside in Arizona, this labyrinth refers to the mischievous creator who resides in a cave below the peak of the Baboquivari mountain, which is a sacred place within the territory of the O'odham nation. So according to their oral history, the Iotai, which is the labyrinth, brings people to the earth from the underworld. Specifically the Hohokam people come to the above ground from the underworld. Apparently the Hohokam were ancestors of both the Tohono O'odham people, which are known as the desert people, and the Akimel O'odham, which are known as the river people. He is also responsible for the gift of Himdag, which is a series of commandments guiding people to remain in balance with the world and interact with it as intended. Visitors to the cave are asked to bring a gift to ensure their safe return from the depths. Which, again, is another reference to labyrinths being a symbol of an entryway into the underworld. And this is all over the world, and it's easy to think that cultures are borrowing from each other, but here, we have the Americas, so it is possible that maybe there was some traveling happening between cultures, but I think it's also possible that each culture had their own story from this separately. I've noticed that a lot of humanity or existence in general actually is more of a web consciousness, a shared consciousness, than it is separate. But maybe that's an idea ahead of its time. Probably not. I mean, if anyone freaky enough is still listening to this podcast, they probably share or know somewhere in their heart that that is true, because evidence is all around us. Anyway, back on topic. So the design of this labyrinth is essentially identical to the classical 7-course pattern. The difference, though, is that the center is more similar to a sun emanating rays, but it has the same idea. It follows the same floor plan. It's just situated differently, and the lines are not uniform thickness. It's honestly like, as an artist and someone who has dabbled in graphic design, I mean, it's a masterpiece. It's one of the coolest symbols I've ever seen, and knowing that it's actually a labyrinth is pretty impressive. It's unbelievably impressive, actually. Apparently, the oldest known version of this labyrinth is dated to about the 17th century, which is also an estimation. The earliest appearances apparently can't really be dated securely. Right, take that as you will. Because, I don't know. I think sadly, a lot of native culture here in the Americas has been destroyed by, it's not funny. I just find it comical. I think doing research sometimes on native history and native tribes, it's kind of heartbreaking because a lot of this research is being done and not really taking into account how much has been destroyed over the last few centuries. And a lot of these cultures in the Americas predominantly had orally told practices and beliefs, so take it with a grain of salt. So apparently the Eotoi, the man in the maze, is a design depicting the experiences and choices individuals make in the journey through life. In the middle of the maze, a person finds their dreams and goals. When one reaches the center, the individual has a final opportunity, which is the last turn in the labyrinth, to look back upon choices made and the path taken before the sun god greets us, blesses us, and passes us into the next world. Which is such a beautiful sentiment, because it is both a portal into the underworld, and yet in the center, a sun god awaits for you, which is super macro-minded, right? Because in our literal underworld, under the ground, there is a core of the earth, which is in a way a sun. And then there's the figurative underworld, which would be the afterlife. And the sun god would be the creator of our existence. Anyway, I find this to be one of the most beautiful labyrinths visually and also sentimentally. I think it's incredible. And also, it makes me sad that I've never heard of it. As someone who was born and raised in the United States, it makes me sad how little native culture I have been exposed to, and I think it's such a shame. The land that I am now recording on is native land, and I'm so sad. I'm so sad of all the things that have happened here, and all the massacres, and all the people that had to die for no reason. For literally no reason. And I think all human history, culture, religion is beautiful and at least rooted in beauty, but specifically the culture in the Americas is incredibly rich and so fascinating and so in tune with nature. It kind of reminds me of Shintoism. There's so much regard for nature in terms of spirituality, and I find that to be incredibly beautiful. So there was actually other labyrinths, petroglyphs, that I discovered that are also from North America, and I actually couldn't find very definitive researcher-specific information about them. So there's one that's like really famous in Riverside County, known as the Hemet Maze Stone, which is a prehistoric petroglyph. It's located in the Lakeview Mountains and Reinhardt Canyon in Riverside, California. And essentially some rich guy named Roger E. Miller donated like almost 6 acres of land along with this petroglyph in 1956. And apparently it was discovered in 1914, and the authorities at the time declared it to be over 2,000 years old. So this is where it gets pretty ridiculous. So some people, some authorities at the time, which granted this was 1914, so we all know the authorities are white dudes, and some of them claimed that they presumed that Chinese explorers had come to the US 2,000 years or more prior and had created this petroglyph. The reason why they thought that was because this maze, it was a multi-cursal labyrinth, so it had a square rectangular shape, and it had an empty square center, but it had these meandering labyrinth-like, pathways that led around this square, and it slightly resembles a swastika. It's not quite as simple as that. There's many more divergence, and it's not perfectly symmetrical. But I guess the Americans at the time just assumed that because it resembled a swastika, which in parts of Asia, specifically Buddhist and Hindu culture, the symbol is used as a sign for peace. It's the sign of the wheel of life. And Hitler used the symbol and actually flipped the direction to use for the Third Reich. But no evidence actually proves that Chinese travelers would actually have made this petroglyph. Looking at it, it to me looks a lot like native art. A lot of native art, baskets, blankets, textiles, actually have really interesting patterns that sometimes end up looking like pieces of labyrinths. And looking at this, I mean, there's really no doubt in my mind that it's native, but I just thought it was interesting that people were assuming that it couldn't possibly have been Native American. There's also been other rock art and petroglyphs in other parts of Riverside and San Diego, and styles that resemble this maze-like swastika. It's known as the Rancho Bernardo style, which is characterized by carefully executed fret elements, generally painted in red, sometimes carved into rock, and occasionally both carved and painted. At their most elaborate, fret designs resemble labyrinths and mazes, although openings to the outside are not necessarily present. The panels occur most characteristically on exposed eastern faces of large boulders, which I find very fascinating because something on the eastern face is where the sun rises, which in my understanding is often associated with creation, and they have these labyrinth-like patterns on the eastern side. It makes me wonder exactly what they intended them for. Obviously, we know a little bit more about the Eotoi-shaped labyrinth, the man in the maze. But I was looking into information about these labyrinths, and sadly, I really couldn't find very much information about what these symbols are used for. I'm sure that it's not lost. I just couldn't really find things online. So if anyone happens to know anything about the labyrinth-like petroglyphs and patterns from California, please email me. So apparently, the rock art sites are said to occur generally near camper village sites, consistent occurrence on the east-facing surfaces, and apparently that had an association with the ceremonial direction toward which the spirits of the dead were believed to depart, according to the Kumeyaay traditions. The complexity and skillful execution of the paintings suggest that they were produced by shamans rather than by lay participants. Indeed, the possibility was raised that all of the paintings might have been produced by a single artist. Again, I just wish I had more, I had better sources. But the last labyrinth that I found that had some information about was actually a Hopi labyrinth or maze known as the Tapaut. And it is thought that the symbol represents the relationship of mother and child, beginning in the center and emanating outwards as the child's world expands, meaning the mother as the cosmic mother or Mother Earth. So a common depiction of this labyrinth, known as the Tapaut, is the classical seven-circuit labyrinth. But the cross that is kind of what is the center point that ends up leading to the middle is actually the shape of a woman. It's incredibly beautiful. But I found it interesting because it reminded me of the Babylonian labyrinths, about some people supposing them to be divination tools for reading intestines of animals, and something about the relationship between mother and child, and looking at this labyrinth of having a woman's shape inside of the labyrinth. The labyrinth actually reminds me of intestines, and almost like the umbilical cord connection between mother and child. So sadly, that was actually all of the information that I could find on native labyrinths. I know that there is more information out there. I sadly just had trouble finding it online. So the next labyrinth I wanted to discuss was one of the other labyrinths mentioned by Pliny, known as the Lemnian labyrinth. So in Pliny the Elder's book of natural history, he lists the legendary Similis, who was reputed to be a contemporary of Dielidas, who, remember, was the architect of the Cretan labyrinth. And together with the historical mid-6th century BC architects and sculptors, he lists a man named Roikos and Theodoros as two of the makers of the Lemnian labyrinth. And apparently, it is evidently, according to some, it's evidently a misunderstanding of the Samian temple's location in En Limnias, which means in the marsh. I'm pretty confused by this information. I put it in here because Pliny mentions it, but even just reading my notes, I'm just genuinely confused. But anyway, Similis was a legendary ancient Greek sculptor, again, a contemporary of Dielidas, and apparently his name was associated with the archaic cult figure of Hera at Samos. Similis was born in the island of Aegina. Now, again, I was looking into this, and I really couldn't find almost any information about this Lemnian labyrinth. Part of why I started this podcast was to start conversations and learn about what other people have discovered, or maybe have discovered because they have other languages that they can read. The next labyrinth that I wanted to talk about is the Jericho labyrinth, which, again, I had never heard of. It is essentially a 7-circuit labyrinth with a circular center, and similar to the Nepalese story, it depicts the city of Jericho inside a series of walls shaped like a labyrinth. So there are actual illustrations of the Jericho labyrinth in the Fari Bible, which was found in Yemen. And this is one of the only 3 known Hebrew manuscripts with illustrated carpet pages. Fascinating. In Yemen. So apparently, according to these pages, so just to paint a picture, one of the illustrations is simply the labyrinth, which someone illustrated walls actually in the shape of the labyrinth and a city in the center, and then there's Hebrew writing at the top. But there's actually another illustration where there is the labyrinth with the opening actually at the top, which is also rare. And the Hebrew inscription is actually following the shape of the labyrinth. So it's a 6-circuit labyrinth, and the walls are often depicted as red lines. And the way to the middle, known as Adrian's thread, is indicated through a banner. With this, the structure of the labyrinth is revealed very well. The entrance on top. In a great number of manuscripts, the city of Jericho is shown as a labyrinth or in the center of a labyrinth. This tradition is proved in different cultural spheres from the 9th up to the 19th century. The labyrinth type used for the Jericho labyrinth is from the classical 7 circuit to the Chartres labyrinth. So we'll touch on the Chartres labyrinth in a bit. But essentially, the Jewish tradition believed that there were 7 walls around the city of Jericho. And it does bear similarities to the 7 circuit labyrinth, but it actually does have quite a different plan. There are 4 dead ends in the walls, but it is actually an ingenious design, because if you were to put a city in the center, the 7 circuit labyrinth would be easy to breach the first wall and be immediately in the center. And the way that this is set up, you would have to breach 2 walls upon entering to actually make a shortcut into the center. So it is actually an ingenious design and looks really cool. Looks different than a lot of the other classical labyrinths. So, according to some sources, medieval Jews who looked at the Jericho story imagined that Jericho was not just a walled city, but a 7-circuit labyrinth. That God had in fact asked the Israelites to walk the labyrinth to penetrate into the city and into the good land beyond it. Thus was born the Jericho labyrinth, a decorative motif found in medieval manuscripts of a 7-looped labyrinth, usually illustrated as a walled city, always being labeled Jericho. Thus, our ancestors grasped in the story of Jericho the metaphor that life is full of reversals, that sometimes the way toward your goal may actually take you further away from it for a while, as a labyrinth does. The concept of the city Jericho as a labyrinth apparently became widespread, and Jericho illustrated by a labyrinth can be found in manuscripts in Europe, Asia, and in both Roman Catholic and Greek Orthodox tradition, as well as the Jewish and Christian, Syrian, and Armenian traditions. Which, I mean, I haven't read the whole Bible, but I have never heard of this. The concept of the labyrinth as a symbol of a city was also known in Islamic culture. The Arabic geographer Al-Qazwini gives some curious information about Constantinia, or Constantinople, in his cosmography, which he finished in 1276. Another earlier testimony for the labyrinth as a symbol of a city in the Islamic tradition comes from the Arabic polyhistor Al-Biruni, who did a work on India, which he finished in 1045 in Ganza, which is in Afghanistan. In his book about India, he stated that the symbolic value of the labyrinth has shifted slightly, and that labyrinths represent castles instead of cities, which does kind of check out, because the story about the Nepalese labyrinth that was guarding a city, it was the Tibetan monk who actually claimed that the city had a series of walls, but the castle is what actually had the labyrinth around it. So according to this man, Al-Biruni, he's saying that the word labyrinth actually represented the idea of a castle, and then over time started to symbolize cities. In his work, he also stated that he had evidence for this concept as early as the 11th century. Al-Biruni writes about the castle of the demon Ravana on Lanka, and the castle is illustrated as a labyrinth. So I actually looked up the palace of Ravana, and some believe it to actually be in Sri Lanka. Confirmation on that is not definitive, but there actually is a Machu Picchu like city built on top of this huge rock, which has, what is it called? I guess it's a mesa. It's this huge rock that on the top is this flat city. And so it is a possibility that the walls and the weaving spaces in between the buildings could have been perceived as a labyrinth. Who's to say? So again, there's so many labyrinths that I've looked up. A lot of them don't really have clear examples or necessary ideas of what the labyrinths really suggested. But in Europe, I actually found a huge amount of labyrinths that could also possibly predate the story of the Cretan labyrinth. A lot of them are known as turf mazes. In Wales, they're known as Caerdroea. Again, not sure if that's totally correct, but the Caerdroea is known as the Welsh turf maze. It's usually depicted as the classic Cretan labyrinth, which is the 7-path unicursal labyrinth. And they were created by shepherds on hilltops and apparently were used for the setting of ritual dances, which sadly don't really go on as much anymore. At the center of these turf mazes would usually be a small mound or hillock, as they're called, or in Welsh they were called timpaths. A gathering for folk dancing in Wales is still called a timpath. These turf mazes, which were known as Caerdroea, actually meant labyrinth or maze, and apparently part of the meaning was serving as a puzzle. They also were used interchangeably to mean Troy or walls of Troy, which again lines up with the idea that labyrinths were what would encase a city. Because of the similarity between the Welsh word of troio, which is a plural of tro, which is to turn, and the second element of Troia, meaning Troy, the name was later popularly interpreted as meaning the fortress of turns. Many turf mazes in England were also named Troy Town or the walls of Troy, or variations of that, presumably because, in popular legend, the walls of the city of Troy were constructed in such a confusing and complex way that any enemy who entered them would be unable to find his way out. Which is also mind-blowing because these are, again and again, there's stories of great ancient cities being walled in by labyrinths. There's another tenuous connection about Wales and Troy that has been disproven by historians, but remains a resilient myth. Apparently, an early Welsh historian created a Christian classical genealogy which placed Brutus of Troy, grandson of Aeneas and liberator of enslaved Trojans, as founder of Britain. This Brutus is generally considered a medieval fiction. Wow, 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 wow. This just gives me tingles because obviously I don't think I've heard any Greek myths about Troy having labyrinth walls, but to hear that so many cultures have ancient stories of cities being walled in with labyrinths really, I just have so many questions. This is when I wish I could time travel. So apparently also in Russia, there's a series of islands known as the Solovetsky Islands, which is located in the Onega Bay of the White Sea. The Solovetsky Islands have labyrinths known as the Vaviloni, which means Babylon. Which is fucking crazy. Apparently, there have been more than 30 stone labyrinths preserved on these series of islands. The most remarkable monument is the stone labyrinth of Bolshoi Zayatsky, a group of some 13 stone labyrinths in just a small enclosed area of one island. Local archaeologists have speculated that these labyrinths may be 2,000 to 3,000 years old. That's not necessarily definitive. Apparently, it's hard to date inscriptions on rock, you can date the age of a rock, but it's hard to definitively date when a rock was carved. But I was pretty surprised to find that there was also labyrinths on remote islands in Russia. So there's actually also labyrinths from Germany. They're known as Wunderkreis, which means wonder circle. And in a place called Kaufbeuren, I don't know if I'm saying this correctly, but I will say pronouncing German words is incredibly entertaining. So apparently in the Tanzelhäusl, which is a little forest for dancing people, located in Kaufbeuren, existed a Wunderkreis, or a wonder circle, at least from 1846 until 1936. It served as a dancing labyrinth for the historical and still today celebrated dancing festivity known as Tanzelfest. It was sadly destroyed in 1936 because the army needed the area. Ah, typical. So apparently, I've heard different theories. We're going back to why some of these European labyrinths are known as Troy towns. Apparently, there was an Etruscan terracotta wine jar from a part of Italy known as Tragliatella. And apparently this terracotta wine jar actually had a 7-ring labyrinth marked on it with the word Truia, which may refer to Troy. And to its left, there were 2 armed soldiers appearing to be riding out of the labyrinth on horseback, while on the right, 2 couples are shown copulating. So apparently this vase dates back to about 630 BC, and the ancient Roman equestrian event known as the Troy game, which involved riding in maze-like patterns, had sometimes been linked to this vase. So, I mean, again, I don't really know the specifics, but I guess there was some kind of polo or horse riding game involving a labyrinth, and maybe the practice of this horse riding game and this inscription on this wine jar ended up leading people to associate labyrinths with the word Troy. There's not specific information that backs that up, but I just find it fascinating. So also in Finland, there's evidence of stone labyrinths, and they are called Fjorstoring, or Jerusalemsfröstoring, or Jerusalem Havitis. Again, pardon my pronunciation. But apparently the translation of this actually means the destruction of Jerusalem. And in Estonia, they called the labyrinths Jerusalema Lin, meaning the city of Jerusalem, or Turgi Lin, meaning the city of Turks. So again, here are more references to ancient cities far away being associated with labyrinths. So it's just mind-blowing. In Sweden, there's about 300 known labyrinths that are in pristine condition, about 100 of those which can be found on the coast and the islands of the Swedish Lapland. The custom of creating labyrinths probably originated in what now is known as southern Sweden sometime around 400 to 500 AD. In the middle of Sweden, labyrinths are often found close to old tribal communities or old burial grounds, which again reminds me about the entrance to the underworld. In Sweden, labyrinths have been named Nineve, Viborg, Trollheim, or Constantinople, or Trojaborg, meaning city of Troy, or Trelleborg. So again, they're calling it either Constantinople or city of Troy. I just find this to be so fascinating. I had no idea that this association was so global. And Also references to it being associated with the underworld. Oh, it just gets me so excited. So in the Baltic areas, there was also stone labyrinths called Trojaborgs, meaning Troy Town, often found near shorelines of fishing settlements. Apparently, fishermen would walk them before going to sea to ensure favorable winds, bountiful catches, and to befuddle the trolls known as the Smagubar. I want to know more about the trolls. We'll probably do an episode specifically about the Smagubar because I am a troll person, troll affiliate, and I love trolls. I also think that's interesting too that they were used for good luck and to have good catches and to befuddle trolls, because with the idea of them being entryways to the underworld, maybe something about walking the labyrinth would get you closer to your ancestors, to the spirit world, to ask for protection. Just a thought. I don't know. Apparently they were also used for Jungfraudens, which apparently during springtime, a young female virgin would stand in the center of one of these labyrinths, and men would race to the center to win her hand in marriage. I mean, as someone who loves attention, there's a part of me that like kind of loves that, but like ultimately a man definitely designed this designed this method to marry women, because like what, a race? I'm sorry. Patriarchy is so bewildering to me that who has been allowing this to continue? I mean, obviously men. Obviously men. Because I just I don't know. I guess though, if I was a teenager, like let's say I was 15 and I was like the center of attention and put in the center of a labyrinth, and they told me that there was going to be a race, like I guess there was a part of me that would like get high off of the attention. So I'm not going to say that, like, if I don't know, who's to say that I wouldn't object at a tender age of 14 or 15. But as a fully grown adult, I should say, as a 28-year-old who is societally supposed to be a fully grown adult, I have some drawbacks to this method of courtship. Yeah, so Jungfraudens, fascinating. So there's also a lot of the more famous labyrinths that are still known to this day are actually church labyrinths, often painted on walls or ceilings, and sometimes actually mosaiced on floors. And less popularly known, that a lot of European churches actually had labyrinth graffiti on them, inside or outside, that have usually been concealed over time. But the graffiti indicates that they were not originally a part of the design, obviously. Apparently, a lot of these labyrinths were depicted alongside mermaids, dogs, ships, demons, and soldiers. Which, again, actually makes me think about, the underworld or the afterlife, because ships, demons, soldiers, dogs, these are things that I like associate with death, right? Soldiers die in war, dogs don't live very long. A lot of people lose their life out at sea. There's demons and also mermaids, which are kind of associated, for men at least, associated with the demise of man out at sea. They're often luring men to their deaths. For me, a mermaid is just my queen. So there's also really similar labyrinths in northern continental Europe, also kind of like turf mazes. The difference of a turf maze versus a regular maze is that a turf maze is built out of actual earth, whereas a lot of the other northern European labyrinths are actually built out of stone. And because of which, stone-lined labyrinths are sometimes easier to date when they were probably made, because turf mazes, again, it's pretty hard to like figure out when somebody molded the earth. But some labyrinths around the Baltic areas have been dated between the 13th century and between the 13th century and modern times, I should say, but apparently the peak of these buildings were between the 16th and 17th century. For some reason, all of these northern labyrinths are almost all at sea, and again, that is associated most likely with the idea of it being used by local sailors in the area for safety. Apparently, many of the Swedish labyrinths are actually inland and oriented toward the midsummer solstice. They have also been used to mark other points in the solar year as well in other parts of Europe and Scandinavia. Another good example is Beltane, or May 1st. This is when the northern Europeans, and in particularly in the British Isles, people dance around the maypole. The labyrinth can be used by a number of dancers, each carrying a long ribbon that is attached to the top of the pole, which is set into the ground at the goal of the labyrinth. As a result of holding on that ribbon and walking in the labyrinth path, a very interesting ribbon pattern is created on the pole and can be undone by walking out, which is mind-blowing and checks out. I've actually back in the day did like a maypole thing, and it was like this very simple lattice pattern where you just do a classic weave. But I never considered being able to do a maypole within a labyrinth. My mind is so blown. I am confused though how it would begin. I guess you'd have to get everyone lined up in the outermost ring. I'm not totally sure how it would work, but it's genius and fucking cool, and we should do it. So in other parts of Europe, there was this Italian labyrinth that I also mentioned that Pliny mentioned. So here we are just tying it all back. And according to Pliny, there was a tomb of a great Etruscan general known as Lars Porsena. And in this tomb contained an underground maze. Again, it just gives me tingles, you guys. I did this research, and even talking about it, I still really can't fathom how there are so many labyrinths around the world that I've never heard of, and so many of them are associated with tombs and the underground and death and life. Oh, okay. Anyway, Pliny's description of the exposed portion of the tomb is intraceable. Pliny, it seems clear, had not observed the structure himself, but is quoting the historian and Roman antiquarian named Varro. The tomb of the Etruscan king, Lars, also known as Mausoleo di Porsena, is a legendary ancient building in what is now central Italy, allegedly built around 500 BC at the Clusium, which is located in southeastern Tuscany. It was described as follows by the Roman writer known as Marcus Varro. Apparently he said that Porsena was buried below the city of Clusium, in the place where he had built a square monument of dressed stones. Each side was 300 feet in length and 50 in height, and beneath the base there was an inextricable labyrinth, into which if anybody entered without a clue of thread, he could never discover his way out. Above this square building there stands 5 pyramids, one at each corner and one in the center, 75 feet broad at the base and 150 feet high. This structure, standing some 200 meters high, was supposedly destroyed along with Clusium itself in 89 BC by the Roman general Cornelius Sulla. No trace of it has ever been found, and historians have generally regarded Varro's account as a gross exaggeration at best and a downright fabrication at worst. Oh, it pains me to read this because I get it. They don't really have proof that this existed, but to me, this is kind of checking all the boxes. Here we have a tomb for a general, which is kind of lining up with the Egyptian idea of having a labyrinth as a tomb. At this point in time in the world, if it was built around 500 BC, that would be quite a while after the Egyptian tomb was built, and 500 BC, I think, predates the Roman occupation of Egypt, I think actually is not far away from those dates. I actually don't know the specific dates, but I don't think they're that far away. And what I'm interested by is the idea of it being underground because, for example, France, in Paris, there's these underground catacombs where they say the same thing. If you don't know your way around, you can easily get lost and die. And would that not be a multi-cursal labyrinth? Apparently the catacombs in Paris have plenty of dead ends and plenty of pathways that lead nowhere. So that's technically a labyrinth. So if it's happening in Paris, it could totally have been happening in Italy. I guess I'm just not totally convinced when people kind of write off these stories because maybe there isn't proof that it existed, but I guess there's no proof that it didn't exist. So I guess I just want to know more. I want to know more, and I'm just not fully convinced. Because, I don't know. I mean, I obviously don't know. I don't really have answers, you guys. I'm just a guy. I'm just some dude. I'm just a bro, and I just do this kind of research for fun, and I really am just not an expert. I'm just an enthusiast. But, guess what? I'm not even done. There's more labyrinths to talk about. So, back to the concept of church labyrinths. There are labyrinths in northern Africa that are actually located inside Christian churches. So, there's a church in Algeria known as the Algiers Cathedral, and there is a labyrinth in it that is known as a Roman labyrinth. A Roman labyrinth is a square labyrinth that has 4 quadrants, and it has a very pretty simple pattern. Each quadrant has kind of like a V shape that complements each corner. But in the center of this labyrinth, there is a square that actually has writing. The entire square is full of words. And apparently, after finally gaining official recognition, the early Christian church conscientiously sought to bring Christianity closer to Roman culture so as to open the faith up to large numbers of people. And one of its ways was accomplished by adopting foreign symbols so their cause could help convert better. I'm misreading my own notes. Basically, they were using foreign symbols to help foreigners better understand the concepts of their religion. So part of why the Roman labyrinth was used here in Algeria is because they were trying to have Roman people find interest in the Christian faith. I love hearing about stories like this because as an American, I associate Christianity with Rome because the Vatican's there. And, Italy is like an incredibly Catholic country, but it's so interesting hearing about a time where other parts of the world were trying to convert Rome to be interested in Christianity. I find it fascinating. The center part of this labyrinth, the words in the center spell out or insinuate meaning associated with a saint known as Saint Reparata, which is unmistakably Roman. Its meaning that it's square and was originally laid down, this labyrinth was laid down in 324 CE, making Saint Reparta the earliest known church labyrinth in the world. So the earliest known church labyrinth in the world is in Algeria. Stay with it, people. The Northern Africans and Southern Indians and people of Bethlehem were doing Christianity first. Unique to this object and Egypt. Anyway, that's actually a whole other topic that we are going to discuss at some point. So, unique to this object, the labyrinth center is comprised of a crossword puzzle, but it's actually a palindrome of Sancta Ecclesia. This means that no matter how you read the phrase, like you could read it forwards, backwards, up or down, it will always say the same thing. As a result, this creates a process of reversal in which the mirroring phrases reflect a higher spiritual truth. with the phrase Sancta Ecclesia, or Holy Church, replacing the figures of Theseus and the Minotaur. This early Christian labyrinth is an assertion that while the journey to the center is perilous, the reward for reaching it is not death, as in the Greek legend, but eternal life. Which kind of indicates the other world, right? I mean, the underworld is often sometimes seen as like hell or death, but it's really just the other world, the spirit world. So, you guys, this is crazy. So apparently, given the labyrinth's early absorption into Christianity, it is surprising that there's actually a 700-year gap between the construction of the Saint Reparatus labyrinth in Algeria and those which would later be constructed in Europe. Well, I don't really think it's that surprising because, Europe's always a little bit late to the party, if you know what I mean. Simply put, 11... Okay, wait, hold on. I'm getting ahead of myself. So, a lot of the church labyrinths would employ eventually 11 circuit labyrinths. So the Roman labyrinth, which is the square shape, was depicted in Algeria. But eventually, as church labyrinths started being used, they were doing the classical... It's kind of more similar to the Jericho labyrinth. They were originally using the classical circuit labyrinth. It was an 11 circuit, but eventually a priest actually engineered it to have a cross so that there was actually extra turning points so that from far away there was actually a cross shape inside of the labyrinth. But the reason why apparently the number 11 was used was because 11 was seen as a stigmatized number after the time of St. Augustine of Hippo and throughout much of the Middle Ages. Apparently, it signified the fallen nature of humanity. 11 was perceived as equating to sin and dissonance with God, being one more than the commandments, yet one short of the apostles. 11, like humanity, is a flawed number, according to medieval Europeans. Despite this corrupted number, the enlarged labyrinths were geometrically perfect. During the Middle Ages, the cosmos, as a product of God, was seen as being without flaw, and as such the circle symbolized divine unity, for it had no beginning nor end. So around 900 CE, an otherwise nameless monk, I was mentioning this. So there was this guy, a monk from the Benedictine monastery, and he is the one who designed the labyrinth with more of a cross shape versus perfectly circular. So it is circular, but there's cross-like stops in it, thus making it inherently more Christian. So that kind of brings us to the more famous labyrinth known as the Chartres labyrinth, or I guess with a French accent would be Le Chartres labyrinth. So this is a charter. It's of the Chartres Cathedral or Chartres Cathedral in France. It's incredibly famous. It's depicted in different churches, and it is one of the more recognizable labyrinths, I think. A lot of people may have seen it or not realized you've seen it. It has the classical 11 circuit design, but with that cross element, and the center of the labyrinth actually has a petal-like shape with 6 petals in the center. The labyrinth center has this 6-lobed rosette, and apparently it was an ancient symbol from the East and was used to portray the nature of God in Sumerian, Babylonian, Jewish, and sometimes even Roman art. Christ, who suffered on earth, or known as the Knave, and then descended into hell, which is the labyrinth, but he defeated death and ascended to heaven, where one day he will judge all of mankind. I feel judged already. Accordingly, the labyrinth points to the moment that the, quote, new God saved humanity, but when connected with the rose window, it represents a call for repentance. This is so very Christian. Repent, you bitch. So there's actually other labyrinths in other parts of Europe. They actually almost always share the same floor plan as the Chart labyrinth. It sounds like Chart, doesn't it? When I say it with an American accent, I'm fine with that. So not all of them have like the 6 rosette center that's like specifically associated with the Chart. So another notable labyrinth is known as the Reims labyrinth, which I believe is also in France. So this one actually has like the same idea. It's the same floor plan, but it's actually in the shape of a hexagon, which I'm sorry, if magic is illegal, then what is this? Because this is fucking, I mean, it's some spell crafting. This labyrinth, as well as other labyrinths, were actually used by Christians praying who would actually walk the labyrinths on their knees as a symbolic pilgrimage to win the favor of God. The path of the labyrinth being a symbol of the path of life being misleading and long and treacherous until you reach the center, which would be God or the heaven. Apparently, this labyrinth I was talking about, known as the Reims labyrinth, was inaugurated on the 6th of January 1286, which seems to be a pretty historic date, the 6th of January. But this was 1286. The labyrinth was actually destroyed in 1779 by the cannons. Apparently, they destroyed the labyrinth because children were playing on the labyrinth during ceremonies. That's depressing. Okay, actually, so now that I'm looking at the Reims labyrinth, I actually have a photo I'm looking at from above. It actually is an octagon. I said hexagon, so I'm totally mistaken. It's an octagon. And on 4 of the corners, on 4 of the edges, I should say, there's actually openings where there's places to stand. But I don't actually think so. No, I think this is actually just an old drawing, because here I'm actually looking at another photo of the church. It is an octagon, but there wasn't these 4 almost reservoir spaces. And so that kind of concludes the majority of the real meat of the research I did. There's obviously other labyrinths that exist. These were the ones I could find the most meat on, which is why I decided to report on them. This is really a never-ending topic. There's also a ton of other shapes that are similar to labyrinths. They don't necessarily qualify as them. Symbols that have qualities that are labyrinth-like. I genuinely could talk about this all day. I also want to reiterate that I am by no means an expert. I am just a simple man, a simple peasant, if you will, doing my best and trying to just meet more friends who are interested in magic, interested in esoteric information, interested with the ancient world. What did you think? Please write me an email at esotericaandnonsense@gmail.com. Do you know things that I don't know? Did you grow up hearing stories from your grandparents, from your parents? Is there a subject that you want to hear about? Do you think that this was ridiculous? Send me any opinion, please. I am open. Send me an email. And this concludes the end of episode